Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another episode of COVID history. I am making this video to try and explain some of the key concepts we're going to be looking at this week in terms of European colonialism or imperialism in the late 19th century, and using this lesson as a bridge between the past few lessons we've been looking at in terms of the Industrial Revolution, the New World Order in Europe and how things are changing in Europe, and reaching ahead then to World War I and what's going to happen in Europe. And I'll do another lesson next week on the causes of World War I, the outbreak of World War I, why that happens. But today, I really want to dial into some of the isms that underlie why it is that the Europeans found themselves in conflict with one another by 1914. And to do that, we have to look at what's going on in the scramble for Africa, the scramble for China, the European power politics that are really beginning to undermine and tear apart the great power system, which has been in existence since Napoleon. And we need to look at how all of these things really bring Europe and the world to a bit of a tinderbox. So today we're going to look at a number of different concepts, a number of different notes and things you can look at to your own heart's content. What I want to focus in on are two key differences or definitional ideas I want you to wrap your heads around in order to make sense of where we're going. The one we're going to talk about, I'm going to spend a little bit of time moving from this into a note, and we'll look at it, is on social Darwinism and Charles Darwin. But before we get to that, what I really want to focus in on is this key concept right here. There's a difference between colonialism and imperialism. So the colonialism of the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, early 1800s even, more properly is known as mercantilism. Mercantilism, root word there is merchant, right? We add a H in. Mercantilism is the idea where the Europeans went to foreign lands in order to find primary products, raw materials that they could use to benefit the mother country. Great examples of this that you're all familiar with: French Canada. Why does Samuel de Champlain go to Canada in 1607 and then 1608 found Quebec? The reason why he's doing that is not because he's looking for an adventure. He's not looking for a remarkable new opportunity. Instead, what he's looking for are products that are going to benefit France, and that's his remit. That's why he's sent by the French king. That's why he's sent in order to find things. And what does French Canada give back to France? They give back raw materials, so lumber and iron ores and cod and beaver pelts, all those things that the French government uses to trade with the rest of the Europeans. Another great example of the mercantilist or colonial policies is the American 13 colonies. So from Delaware in the north all the way down to Georgia, when you look at why they're there, primarily it's for cash crops. They're not there in order to found the New World Order, in order to create liberty and fraternity and equality. They're there to get rich and to make money for England. So what are the cash crops they're looking for? Primarily out of the United States, you've got cotton, and you've got tobacco. Those make a tremendous amount of money for Great Britain, and Great Britain then uses those raw materials to sell as finished goods elsewhere. Britain does the same thing with the islands in the Caribbean, where they're primarily pulling sugarcane out of those islands, turning that into rum, and then selling the rum to make money. That's colonialism. In order to grow the cotton, in order to grow the tobacco, in order to harvest the pelts, you have to leave people there. You have to develop a colonial system. You have to put seigneurs in charge or governors in charge. You have to establish this outreach, this outpost, if you will, of your original country. That's colonialism, right? So again, the merchants are creating a colony. That's what they're trying to do. However, what we're seeing in Europe in the late 19th century, although some people refer to it as colonialism, it's not colonialism. It's more properly known as imperialism. Let me move that down a bit for you. Imperialism, root word of this, empire. The Europeans are all scrambling with one another to try and get as much land as they can. In this case, they don't care what's actually there. In some cases, they luck out. England, when they take over the Middle East, they realize, hey, there's oil that we can use here. When they take over South Africa, they find gold. The French take over most of the Sahara Desert. It's not a good call. Nothing you can do with that. You can't even build sand castles with the sand from the Sahara Desert because the molecules are different. I didn't realize this until a little while ago. But the sand molecules, because of the wind, because of the way the wind whips them around, the sand molecules actually look like this when you blow them up. Whereas the sand molecules that we're used to on the beach are much more jagged like this because of the erosion that's caused by the water and the moving about in the water. And so this, when you try and stack a whole bunch of these on top of one another, they just crumble. But these actually make a really nice sandcastle. You've learned something new. Imperialism in the 19th century is not about the stuff that they get, although in some cases they get stuff. It's about getting as much land as you can. And there are two areas where the Europeans go in order to find land, in order to get stuff. Let me rephrase this in maybe a different sense that might make more logical sense for you. Why did the Europeans go here to England, to the 13 colonies? Why did they go there in the 17th century? They're going there to find products, primary products. By the late 19th century, the Europeans are all fully immersed in the Industrial Revolution, and they have gone chock full with selling stuff to their own people. They have maximized the number of people that can buy pots and pans and shirts and boots and belts and whatever it is you want to sell. Well, when you reach a limit of the number of people that can buy your products because they just have enough of them, right? I mean, everybody's got more than one set of dishes probably, right? You've got the regular dishes that you use, and then you've got the good dishes, the ones that only come out at special occasions. And if you're really lucky, you've got the ultra good set of dishes that only come out if the Queen or the Pope were to show up. They only come out at my place. We haven't got the ultra Pope dishes. We only have the good set. They only come out once a year to be cleaned and then put back. And I'm not allowed to touch them because I'll probably break them. But we don't need 4, 5, 6, 7 sets of dishes. And the same thing applies to everybody else. Well, once you reach a limit of what people are able to buy, companies only have two choices. One, they can stop manufacturing as many of those things, which is going to result in layoffs, which is going to result in people not buying things, which is going to result in a recession. Also a reduction in income, a reduction in governmental taxes that are being paid. The government therefore has less income. The government can spend less money on infrastructure, schools, roads, etc. That's one option. Scale back. The other option is you find new markets for your goods, places where they don't have the pots and the pans and the belts and the buckles and the whatnot. Well, there are two places in the world in the late 19th century that do not have a strong industrial base that are open for grabs: Africa and China. Those two places are where the Europeans now focus. So the big difference between colonialism and imperialism is the end goal. Here, you're trying to find products. Here, you're trying to offload products and sell them to other places. If you can get a captive market, which is true in more ways than one, but if you can get a captive market, then you can sell your goods, you can make more money, and you can go from there. We're going to come back to why imperialism is one of the causes of World War I next week, but that's the root idea behind all this. Now, I want to just jump over here to one of the worst ideas that comes out of the the imperialism, which is social Darwinism. And in terms of social Darwinism, where did I go? There I am. I'm going to present this really quick. Sorry, I'm going to present my entire screen. Yes, present. That's fine. Show, start, share. Gotta love technology. I'm sharing my screen. Thank you, Google, for letting me know that. Okay, here we go. Social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is probably the worst concept that comes out of this imperial period in the late 19th century because of the odious ramifications of social Darwinism. So you guys are familiar with Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin sailed on the Beagle in the middle of the 1800s. He was a naturalist. He went around the world and he began to discover all kinds of different things, different animals and plant species and birds. He was fascinated by finches for some reason. And he was fascinated that you've got all these different birds that are all finches. They've all got different beaks. Some beaks are long, some beaks are short, some beaks are really, really strong, some beaks are really, really fine. And he was fascinated by how nature evolves to adapt to the environment in which it finds itself. So finches that eat mostly hard nuts need to have really strong beaks in order to crack those nuts. But finches where they didn't have nuts, but they had lots of plants with nectar, for example, would drink the nectar with these long, thin beaks like hummingbirds do, but they're still finches. So they've adapted to the environment. And what Darwin came out of this whole year-long experiment on the Beagle, he came up with his idea of what's called natural selection. So nature decides which species survive and which species don't survive, which species are strong and which species aren't strong. And Charles Darwin's ideas of natural selection then evolve into the ideas of evolution. And of course, Charles Darwin was right on the money in terms of how we all evolve and how we interact with the environment and so on. The important thing for us to understand is that when you take Charles Darwin's ideas, as published in his first book, he doesn't talk about people. He just talks about plants and animals and how they evolve. However, he then went back to this idea and began to talk about human evolution. Once the evolution idea began to get some traction, he went back and started looking at human evolution. And as part of that, what he argued was that people must have evolved over time, just like monkeys and just like birds and just like turtles and just like everything else have evolved over time. We must be in a period of constant evolution, constant adaptation, constant change to the environment. The problem with this is that means that there are, if you take that idea to its logical conclusion from the 19th century viewpoint, if you take it to its logical conclusion, what that means is that there are some people that may theoretically be further along in terms of evolution than others. Those that might be more evolved or less evolved, more superior and more inferior. And this is what becomes known as social Darwinism. Darwin never applied this idea on a social level or on a geopolitical level to human societies, but his disciples did. So Herbert Spencer is the guy that's most credited with giving the idea of social Darwinism to society. Herbert Spencer argued that the world is a jungle, that we have to treat human society just like we treat the animal society. The strong will survive, the weak will die. Interestingly, Charles Darwin used the term natural selection. So those that are best suited to the nature in which they find themselves will survive. Those that find themselves not suited, like for example, a polar bear is not going to be able to survive in the Sahara Desert. However, a camel is not likely going to be able to survive in the Arctic if you just took them and moved them from place to place. Nature is deciding that species will not survive, this species will survive, only does it over the course of millions of years. Herbert Spencer changes natural selection to a term you're probably more familiar with, which is survival of the fittest. And what this means is the strong survive, the weak die. If human beings are evolving, and if there are more evolved human beings and lesser evolved human beings, and those that are strongest, those that are the most advanced, are the ones that deserve the most. Just like the strongest lion deserves the lion's share of the kill, and the weaker lions will starve, just like the strong antelope will outrun the lion and the weak antelope will get eaten, the strong humans, the strong human societies should get more. The weaker human societies need to die off or be sublimated or be used by the strong to benefit themselves, like the weak antelope feed the lions. Herbert Spencer's idea that society is a jungle and that the world is a cruel and vicious place and that there are evolved and less evolved human beings becomes the basis of the eugenics mindset in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Now, there are a couple of key objections to social Darwinism, right? Number one, society is not nature. Herbert Spencer argued that if we are animals, just like the animals, then the society in which we live is the jungle, much like the lion lives in a jungle and the animals on the savannah, etc. We don't live in nature. Human beings have expressly constructed an environment that is not the natural world. We live in buildings with windows and air conditioning and power and television and Netflix and all sorts of other things. We go to the grocery store to get our food. The vast majority of us don't grow that. The vast majority of us don't wear shaggy fur on us because we wear clothing because we are not adapted to the environment in which we live. Society is not nature. Human beings don't live in the natural world. We live in an artificial world that is natural now to us, but it is an artificial world. We have built a society to protect us. We don't have sharp claws or good eyesight or good hearing or good senses of smell. We're not very strong and we're not very fast as a species. We need the artificial world to protect us from the real world. So why should we use the laws of the jungle where the strong lion eat and the weak antelope die? Why should we use those lines of logic in a society where we have created artificial ways of living and interacting and governing ourselves and so on? Okay? That's the first opposition to social Darwinism. The second opposition to social Darwinism is, of course, that social Darwinism is immoral, claiming that certain people, by dint of the color of their skin or by dint of their technological advance or by dint of their lack of weaponry or whatever it happens to be, to argue that those people don't deserve all the same things that everybody else deserves is a flagrantly immoral idea. Look at all the laws we've got here in Canada about equality and about opportunity, right? It's about equity of access to all things for all people, regardless of who you are, regardless of what you bring to the table. Social Darwinism argues if you're not providing something, you don't get something. And if you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you deserve to suffer and die. That's how it works. Human society doesn't work that way. We've created a moral world, a legal world to protect ourselves from social Darwinism. That's in the 21st century. The 19th century, though, building on the ideas of what the Europeans were able to achieve in their travels and their exploits into Africa and into China, for lack of better words. And I certainly don't mean to be flippant about what the Europeans do in Africa and in China, which you're going to read about this week. But the Europeans realize, quote unquote, in very large quotation marks with italics, that they are superior to the Africans and they are superior to the Chinese and the Asians by dint of their military technology. They wipe out entire armies of Africans and Asians with very little effort on their part because they've got gunpowder. The Africans are using arrows. The Europeans have got, mechanized warfare, and the Africans are running around with shields made of animal hides. The Europeans trounce the Africans for the most part as they go through, as do they do the Chinese. Well, this leads the Europeans to believe or to think, in a certain sense, that they are superior to the Africans and the Chinese. And what's one thing that the Europeans have in common that they don't have in common with the Africans and the Chinese? The color of their skin. They are white, Africans are not, Asians are not, South Americans are not, Australian Aborigines are not. And this growing idea of white supremacy, not in the sense that we think about it today, not in the sense that we think of white supremacy with the Ku Klux Klan, but whites being superior along a linear scale, much like Darwin envisioned, or much like, in the Origins of Man, where he's talking about the fact that we are on a sliding scale of evolutionary growth. If the whites are most powerful, if the whites are most advanced, if the whites have the most money, if the whites have the most opportunity, therefore the whites must be superior. And this leads to the eugenics movement of the early 20th century. The eugenics movement argues that there are purities in the most advanced human beings and impurities in the lesser advanced human beings. And so what you need to do is you need to breed for a control over how people are able to reproduce. So white people should not reproduce with non-white people, and non-white people should not reproduce with white people, because what you're doing then is you are diluting the bloodlines and so on and so forth. Eugenics, the eugenics movement is trying to maintain or trying to get certain characteristics or maintain certain characteristics through controlled breeding. Who's allowed to breed, who's not allowed to breed, who's allowed to have access, who's not allowed to have access. And this idea, again, a very odious idea, gets picked up on by a guy named Francis Galton, who is a psychologist and one of Charles Darwin's first cousins. And it really finds purchase in Germany in the early 19th century with Dr. Alfred Ploetz, who is the founder of the Racial Hygiene Institute in Germany, who believed that whites are superior, and the further north you go in Europe, the more light-skinned Europeans become. Of course, we know the reason why that happens now is because the vitamin D and the strength of the sun gets weaker as you get further away from the pole. But what Ploetz believed is the further away, the further north you get, the whiter people get, the blonder they get, the blue eyes and so on, and paler skin. So therefore, the more northern Europeans are the most advanced, and they work their way down to the darkest skin colors of people who are the least advanced. And below all of them, Dr. Alfred Ploetz said, are the Jews, because Jews do not have a particular racial group or a particular skin color. They are an amalgam of all different skin colors. They're all different groups of people, according to Dr. Alfred Ploetz. And so they are not a pure group of people. They are the most impure, as opposed to the purest Nordic Aryan group at the top. And I think you can see, without beating this to too fine a point, you can see where Dr. Ploetz's ideas will eventually lead the European mindset. It's not just the German mindset, but it's the European mindset. Dr. Alfred Ploetz in 1905 founds the Society for Racial Hygiene. He begins to teach in schools that about the Aryan race, about Nordic superiority, and so on. And this is an idea that finds real purchase, real acceptance in Europe in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and will become the basis, of course, for the Holocaust, which we'll look at shortly. Okay, so what we're going to look at now, and I'm going to come back to myself for a quick sec. There we are. So that's the ideas of imperialism versus colonialism and social Darwinism, which becomes the basis of the eugenics movement and the racist ideologies of not just the Germans and not just the Nazis in the 1930s, but all of the Europeans by the 1930s. We're going to look at how all the European powers and Canada and the United States were all very anti-Semitic prior to World War II. We're going to look at why that is, but a lot of it has to do with the social Darwinism, the general acceptance of social Darwinism. So today and this week, what you can do is there's a number of notes that I'm going to post for you on Google Classroom, and you can look through those. They're going to give you some detailed understandings of how the Europeans get access to or gain control over Africa, and there's a note on how they gain control over China. I'm also going to put in there a bunch of extra readings you can do, which are quite interesting along a couple of different ways. I'm going to give you a reading on social Darwinism. Sorry, not social Darwinism, but Darwin's ideas about human evolution, which is, it's a tough read, but I've got some guiding questions for it. I think if you're really interested in this idea of human evolution and what Darwin really meant, have a read through that. I'm also going to post a couple of excerpts from a book called Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which really gets to the heart of social Darwinism and the idea of white supremacy. I'm also going to post for you an article or a contrasting document from, there's a poem by Rudyard Kipling, who wrote the Jungle Book, which some of you may have read, Mowgli and Baloo the Bear and so on, Shere Khan. Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem in 1898 called The White Man's Burden, which, yes, is just as racist as it sounds. The white man's burden is about the concept that white people have a moral obligation to help these black people and help these non-white peoples get better, to become like us. Isn't that a wonderful concept? It really gets to the heart of the European mindset towards non-white peoples. But I've counterposed that with a great response article from 1903 called The Black Man's Burden, which looks at how the Africans view the white people coming into their countries with these two opposing mindsets, which is kind of a cool thing. When we look at China, I'm going to post a couple of key documents that you can look at after you read the note on Chinese imperialism, just to give you a sense of how the Europeans end up in China, how they end up in Africa. And they get to a couple of the key ideas, a couple of key rebellions, the Boxer Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, and looking at how the Europeans set in motion the ideas that are eventually going to lead to the rise of Imperial Japan and the attack on Pearl Harbor and the rise of the Americans and the atomic bomb. It's also at the root of why it is that the Americans and the Chinese are in conflict with one another right now. The geopolitical conflict in the late 19th century is still very much alive in the 21st century in this time of COVID. So lots of stuff I'm going to post for you this week. As before, I'll have a question that you can do based on the bare minimum, but by all means, watch as much as you want, read as much as you want. I'm also going to post a video you can watch on the Europeans in Africa in the early 19th century. Lots of good stuff this week. So I hope you found this video interesting. Hope you found it enjoyable. And I am going to stop this right now. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you all again next week. Take care.